So unlike today, there was a very small standing army in the United States. We've talked about that a little bit before. That remains true when Civil War officially breaks out. And so as a result, they are going to rely entirely on citizens and volunteers who are willing to fight. The vast majority of them are not trained professionals on either side. They really don't have regimented uniforms or things like that. You can see this picture on the right. They kind of look a little ragtaggy compared to what you expect of the military in terms of modern perspectives. Despite requests for the limited number of volunteers, 2 million men will volunteer to fight in the North and 1 million will volunteer to fight in the South. Now, keep in mind when you see that number, it does not indicate that the South was less willing to participate. You have to remember just how few white men there were in the South at this time, right? It was an African American majority, and so there just weren't as many white men to volunteer. So it is perhaps even indicative of a greater level of participation in the South than in the North. So in the Union only, of course, 10% of soldiers will be African American. Not many escaped slaves, but some were, and their reason for being interested is pretty apparent, I think, and self-explanatory. 50% of soldiers will be married and leaving families behind. Now that's a pretty high number compared to a lot of armies. And so that is going to complicate the realities of both the North and the South, as a lot of those men do not come home. 50% will also be under the age of 22, which means that they also account for the majority of the younger generation of men. Again, that's going to have a lot of impact on the society when many of them die during the course of the war. In both societies, volunteering will be seen as a masculine duty in both the North and the South, and that in the North, it's because they're protecting their family and their way of life, which is an acceptable use of force in terms of Victorian culture. And in the South, of course, they're defending their honor and their way of life, which is then, of course, acceptable in the honor culture. So you can see how those ideals overlap a little bit. About 20,000 women will volunteer to serve as nurses in the North and the South. A very, very small percentage of women will disguise themselves and fight in the military or serve as spies. Only about 400 women in total, though, will do so. So that is a pretty small number. So when the war begins, a lot of people, particularly in the North, though also in the South, will consider this to be pretty straightforward. Of course, each side expects that they will be the winners, but there is an expectation among a lot of people that this will be a fairly simple war. And part of that has to do with the fact that this is quite a novelty, right? There is no one left really who experienced the Revolutionary War, at least not in great numbers. And so the idea of a battle on their own turf among their own people was quite interesting and mind-blowing, and also kind of entertaining at first for those who just didn't know what to expect. And so the North really holds on to that idea that they will have the upper hand, and they take that with them as they enter into the first major battle, which is the Battle of Bull Run, or in the South they call it Manassas, which takes place in Virginia in July of 1861. So 30,000 Union troops will meet 22,000 Confederates, and the plans for both were pretty well known, particularly in the North. In fact, civilians from the North and the South will actually pack picnic baskets and go and watch the battle break out until they discover that artillery is actually quite dangerous, and so they have to run away and create a lot of chaos. So it's just that's just an example of how kind of detached some people were from the expectations of war. Now, the Union troops, though, will be defeated pretty quickly, and though the Confederate forces were smaller, they were just ultimately better prepared, and it showed. And that will be kind of a continuing trend. There will be high Union losses with Confederate victories for most of that first year and a half of the war. And part of that is because the Confederates are not pursuing battles. They are sticking to their plan of only defending what they have and largely wait on the Union to make their moves. And that is also an advantage for the South in a lot of ways, because you just don't have to do as much planning, really. If you think about it, you don't have to focus as much on the unknowns if you're the one who's just ready to wait and fight. The Union advantage that they did have, though, was their ships. And like I said, that wasn't a huge part of the expectation of fighting in this particular Civil War, but they begin to focus on their strengths and find other ways to kind of undermine the South. And one thing that they felt would be particularly effective would be blockading the southern ports in order to essentially strangle them out. They wanted to cut the South off completely from any sort of provisions. The Union territories will also take a stance against the fugitive slave laws. They will declare that fugitive slaves are contraband of war, which is to say that they become the possession of the person who has them. So by being their enemy, the South has forfeited their rights to these slaves, and they announce that they will not be sent back to them. This is not still an end of slavery. Remember, slavery still exists in the border states, but you can imagine that this does have a lot of kind of impact on slaves, and you'll see an increase in efforts to escape. So there will be continued brutality and loss on both sides, very, very high casualties, and that can really be seen in the Battle of Antietam, which took place in September of 1862. It is kind of the cap of this increasingly brutal reality and desperation, as it had become obvious to everyone at this point that this war was not going to end anytime soon. It remains the bloodiest single day of battle in all of United States history, with 12,000 Union troops and 10,000 Confederate troops lost in that single day. So Robert E. Lee and his men are ultimately forced to retreat, and Lincoln claims this as a Union victory. And he does this not because he really thinks that the Union is now winning, but because the morale in the North has become so low. And so this does prove to be an important turning point for Northern morale. It was a good boost for a lot of people in the North, even though technically the Union troops had experienced a higher degree of losses. In reality, though, in the broader picture of things, the war was at a stalemate. There were continued losses on both sides, a lot of death, but there were no gains. And I think is probably pretty understandable at this point, you have a lot of people who begin to wonder what it is they're really fighting. And that becomes more complicated as the motivations for the war begin to change after the end of 1862 and throughout 1863. So the war is already exceptionally nasty from the beginning, but it has now dragged on and on and on. And as a result, morale is declining. And when that happens, you get a declining amount of volunteers. And with the high casualty rate, they're also running out of soldiers who have enlisted. And as a result, both the North and South are forced to enact the draft. The South will enact it first in 1862. Again, because of their reduced population, they had more need for replacements. And then the North will enact the draft beginning in early 1863. And the Union will then at this time decide to go after the main source of Southern capital, which was their slaves. However, it was only a military strategy. It was not full emancipation for anyone. In fact, the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863 was an effort to get states from the South to rejoin the Union and end the war. And those who refused, it said that their slaves would be freed in any Confederate territory refusing to rejoin the Union that was not already under Union control. So if you think about what that means for a little bit, they're essentially freeing slaves only in the states where there is no Union presence and that is run by a government that considers itself a different country. So as you can imagine, it really is purely symbolic. It does not free states and border states. There is nobody to enforce this law in those southern states that have refused to rejoin the Union, which all of them refuse. And so it doesn't really accomplish anything in terms of facts, but it is very symbolic. And again, we'll see an increase in efforts to escape to the north. Also during this time, though, the South will begin to realize that they need to manufacture their own goods. And so there will be a spike in industrialization in the South, particularly in Richmond and Atlanta. Nothing on the scale of what exists in the North, but it is the idea that they need to begin to do so. And more people begin to move into the cities because the battles are being fought in the country land. And so that leads to widespread urbanization, kind of like what we had seen in the North sometime earlier. But that's not to say that everyone kind of gets in line with this message. In fact, in both the North and the South, you'll have increasing disagreements with quite a bit and a lot of frustration and bitterness that develop. So not all Northerners whatsoever are in support of this idea of emancipation for any reason. And even though it's a military strategy, many believe that it's only a matter of time before it becomes something permanent. And they don't necessarily like that idea. That is not what they had signed up for. And so when Lincoln enacts the draft in 1863, there will be a series of riots, particularly in New York City in July of 1863, in which poorer populations, primarily immigrants, will begin to protest violently the fact that they are being forced to fight for a cause that they didn't really agree with. They will target African American communities. They will burn African American orphanages, and they will burn or attack draft officials and draft offices. And it lasts for 3 days before Lincoln is forced to order Union troops go in and put it to rest. Now in the South, people are beginning to starve, and a lot don't believe that the Confederacy government is providing for its citizens in the ways that it should. And you can see an example of this in the Southern food riots. So there are a lot of women, for example, it is actually primarily women who, beginning in 1863, begin to organize a series of food riots, or sometimes called bread riots. And they essentially organize together to break into a series of stores and take the goods that are needed, because due to inflation, they also could not afford it, and the government was not addressing that problem. There will also be growing class disparities in both regions, and many people will come to refer to this as a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. And if you wonder what that means, just think about it for a little bit. It is something that has been organized primarily by men who had various powers in Congress, right? Wealthy men who represented the nation in the government. And most of the soldiers were increasingly poor, particularly once the riot was enlisted, because there weren't a whole lot of regulations or randomness like there is now. And on top of that, the North and the South each made exceptions in the draft by allowing wealthy people a way out. In the North, if you could pay $300, you could defer your draft. And in the South, if you could pay a high sum, or if you had more than 10 slaves, you were exempt. So as a result, there really was kind of this institutionalized way of ensuring that it was only poor men who were fighting this battle, that the upper levels of society were somehow protected. There will also be extreme suffering in both the field and at home. For every one person who died in combat during the Civil War, 3 died of disease. There was not a lot of sanitation. The surgery practices, the camp hospitals were not particularly clean. Medical treatment had not advanced in the ways that a lot of things, even including weapons, had. And so you can imagine that that isn't a great thing for people who are in need of medical care. In the South, you have widespread starvation, and also you have women who are left behind in a culture where they are not necessarily prepared to be independent, typically raped and abused by soldiers on both sides, but particularly the North. And the South, who had expected foreign aid, like I said, will be disappointed when that foreign assistance never does come. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that these European nations are not really as dependent on cotton as the South and even the United States as a whole had believed, and they didn't want to risk upsetting the federal government of the United States by supporting this rebellion. And that is probably a primary reason why the South will ultimately lose.